morning, everyone. My name is Michael Blake, one of the vice chairs for the Democratic National Committee. Thank you for and regularly reject. Our job should be making it easier for people to vote, not harder. And so we have come forward to create a commission that is focusing on what are we going to do to protect the opportunities for Americans to vote all across the country and all of the time. We'll be here to be making sure we provide consistent response back on what is coming from the Trump administration. When you have leadership such as Chris Kobach, who has demonstrated regularly of trying to find more ways for people to have difficulty to vote, it's the reasons why we're pushing back in this manner. We're expanding the work under our vice chair, Karen Carter-Peterson, who specifically is overseeing civic engagement and voter participation to, again, find more ways for people to vote. We understand, we hear this nonsensical myth of voter fraud. It is not happening. We are not seeing that. But what we are seeing is that people need to have more opportunities to have a chance to go vote, and we are committed to that here at the DNC. As part of that work, we've launched the commission, DNC Commission to Protect American Democracy from the Trump administration. We will not allow them to move forward in a manner that will hurt our communities, and especially when you see that their leadership is not led in a bipartisan way. Their chair, their vice chair, both are Republicans, and many Republicans that are on that commission have found ways to push back against us. The commission that we've pulled together, though, is to make sure we have the democratic response, to demonstrate that we are serious in making sure we push back on what we hear from the Trump administration, but actually find more ways for people to vote. We should be finding ways for people to have more access to vote. We should find more ways for people to have the opportunity to get registered. We should be talking about vote by mail. We should be talking about early voting. We should be talking about the opportunities for more of our communities to be engaged rather than the fear that's coming from the Trump administration. As we saw the Trump administration and the commission requesting data, which was obviously soundly rejected across the country in a bipartisan manner, to demonstrate that is not what we should be pursuing. Lastly, this is our continual attempt of demonstrating the new vision of the Democratic Party, of saying we will come together and show our leadership in all aspects, whether it be in the federal government, whether it be in the states, whether it be in the cities, to say people should be having an opportunity to vote, not have their votes taken away. So with that, a great leader out of the state of Missouri and across the country, the chair of our commission, Jason Kander.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Thank all of you for coming. Thank you very much. Let me just start by talking about how it is that the Trump Commission actually got started in the first place. It is important for us to remember how this started. It started with the biggest lie that a sitting president has ever told, when President Trump, at the time President-elect Trump, said that 3 to 5 million illegal voters had voted in the election. Now, when he did that, most Americans looked at that and understandably simply saw a deeply insecure human being who was trying to soothe his own ego about his margin of loss in the popular vote. And people thought maybe that's all that this was. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but it's more than that. That is why you have not seen, for instance, Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell or other elected Republican leaders stand up and say, you know what, that's not true. The reason that you haven't seen that is because it fits in perfectly with what their strategy is, which is to get a lie like that out into the ether, out into the conventional wisdom. Because if people believe that, it makes a difference. So this commission started as a way to try and legitimize, to try and justify the biggest lie that a sitting president has ever told, this commission being the Trump Commission. But it is morphed from there. And what it's become now is just a vehicle for voter suppression. And it's important for us to remember what the recent GOP history on voter suppression has been. I'm the former Secretary of State of Missouri. I was the chief election official in a state with a Republican supermajority. I've seen the GOP voter suppression playbook up close. And here's what it is. There's 3 steps to it. Step 1 is to undermine faith in American democracy so that people believe that drastic measures have to be taken. Step 2 is to put up obstacles to voting. Step 3 is to put up obstacles to those obstacles. That's how the GOP voter suppression playbook works. And what you're seeing from the Trump Commission, what I refer to as the Voter Suppression Committee to re-elect the president, what you're seeing from them is just step one in that process. And it's important to remember that this is not really, they pretend it is, but it's not really a policy difference between the parties. It is a political strategy from the Republican Party that goes back decades now. And here's what it's about. It's not for them about, their political strategy is not about trying to reach out and include groups like minorities, women, low-income folks, the disabled. It's not about crafting policies that might include them. Instead, they have this political strategy of excluding them from the political process by making it harder for certain folks to vote, including them. So the idea is that if they can keep them from voting, they can win elections. So it shouldn't be viewed as a policy difference. It should be viewed for what it is, which is a political strategy for them that's no different than where they run their TV ads or where they send mailers or whose doors they knock on. That is what voter suppression is about for them. And finally, we should talk about two things. One, this data grab, because it demonstrates what I'm talking about, and second, who's on their commission. This recent attempt that they've made to grab up all this data and create an unprecedented database of information that includes your political party demonstrates that what this probably is an attempt to figure out who you voted for so they can decide whether or not to try and push you off the rolls. That's why you've seen bipartisan opposition to this. It's why you've seen people like the Mississippi Secretary of State, a Republican, stand up and say that they can go jump in the Gulf of Mexico. And in terms of actual voter suppression, it's already started from this commission because there are reports, unfortunately, around the country, and we are encouraging people not to do this, by the way, to do the opposite of this, to help get their friends registered instead. But we are seeing people across the country so concerned about this that they're pulling their voter registrations, which is an immediate demonstration of voter suppression. So finally, you just look at who's on their commission, who's leading their commission. Vice President Pence has a history in Indiana of voter suppression, a history of attacking legitimate and, frankly, patriotic voter registration drives, because that's what a voter registration drive is. It's patriotic. You have folks like Hans von Spakovsky, who was too controversial to be a member of the Federal Election Commission, and now they think that he should be on this commission. And finally, you have Secretary of State Chris Kobach of Kansas. Secretary of State Kobach, somebody that I have some familiarity with. When I went to my first National Association of Secretary of States meeting 5 years ago, when President Obama was putting forward a package of legislation to try and make voting more convenient and more accessible in this country, Secretary Kobach stood up and said that his commission to do so and that the legislation to do so was wrong, that the federal government should have no role in any of this, that it's complete overreach. Well, now that President Trump is in power, Secretary Kobach obviously has a very different view. He is somebody who is the lead vote suppressor in this country, has spent loads of Kansas taxpayer dollars in order to try and prove voter fraud, and has just been completely unsuccessful. And the last thing I'd say is that, we've already had this argument in this country. American heroes marched across a bridge in Selma, facing down dogs and batons and hoses for the simple idea that we all count and we all get a right to vote. And we are fortunate to be joined today by a native of Selma, by Congresswoman Terry Sewell, who is the vice chair of this commission, who is the co-chair of the Voting Rights Caucus in the House of Representatives, and just is an incredible champion for voting rights. So, Congresswoman Sewell, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Jason. I want to begin by saying that while I don't believe in our president's baseless voting fraud claims, and while I don't believe that we can trust this administration with the facts, and while I am deeply disturbed by the characters who the president has chosen to put on his commission, I do agree with our president on one important point. Our elections are in need of repair, and the American people deserve solutions that will strengthen our democracy. Over the past decade, our country has seen a new wave of voter suppression tactics that keep low-income and minority voters from casting their ballots. The Supreme Court has struck down our nation's most powerful voter protections, and our election infrastructure is out of date. And we need to protect our elections from online threats and cyber attacks. The integrity of our election is at risk, but not from voter fraud. If the president is truly concerned with the integrity of our elections that this commission has been charged to do, there are some real questions that our democracy faces. Like, what can we do to ensure that every American is able to participate in our democracy? How can we restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and our nation's most powerful voter protections? How can we ensure that states are equipped with the most up-to-date technology to run elections? I have the great fortune of sitting on the House Intelligence Committee, and I can tell you that our elections are in trouble. There is election integrity, but it's not because of voter fraud. It's because of voter suppression and because of our outdated infrastructure. So there are lots of things that President Trump can be doing to actually help Americans and this democracy have better elections. But this commission is not one of them. As Jason said, I have the great honor of representing my hometown of Selma, Alabama, as well as Birmingham and Montgomery, the old civil rights district here in Congress. And I can tell you that people died, bled, and fought for the right to vote. And it is unacceptable that this president would make a mockery out of voting by having a commission that's focused on voter fraud and not on voter suppression. This is very personal to me because so many of my constituents marched across that bridge, died, fought for the right for all Americans to have access to the ballot box. Your vote is your voice. And we here on this commission, the DNC's commission, we here will make sure that the voices of the excluded are not always the voices of the voiceless. We plan to be that voice. And I can tell you, President Trump, that we will be watching your commission. We will be making sure that your commission stays on task because there are integrity issues with our election process. But voter fraud is not the problem. It truly is voter suppression. I look forward to working with Jason and the rest of the commission. I am honored today to introduce next Alex Padilla, who is the Secretary of State for California, who is a champion in fighting on behalf of voter integrity for those people in California and across this nation. Alex?
Thank you, Representative Sewell. Thank you, Jason, and everybody that's gathered here today. It's my honor to serve on this commission as well. And yes, this is a big day for democracy, because very soon Trump's Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity will meet for the first time, but they're going to meet behind closed doors with no ability for the public to attend, no ability for the public to view what they're going to be doing, and no opportunity for the public to begin to hold them accountable for this journey that they're on now. And it's understandable why, because it's clear that they refuse to invite American citizens to witness what the Trump administration's agenda really is, and that's to roll back the clock on voting rights and attack our democracy. As Jason laid out, the commission was created for a couple of reasons. Number one, to soothe the president's ego for he lost a popular vote and can't reconcile with that fact. And so what does he do in response? He makes up this lie of millions of illegal votes cast across the country. We invited him back then and have yet to see one shred of evidence from Team Trump to back up his claims of massive voter fraud. So what does he do instead? He creates this sham commission to strengthen the integrity of our elections, and we're using air quotes here, because we know what the truth is when it comes to voter fraud. There have been studies, there have been investigations, there have been reports issued, and they all say the same thing. Voter fraud is extremely rare and always very isolated. So if that's not where this commission is going, where are they going? We don't have to guess. Look at the memo that Secretary Kobach presented to then-President-elect Trump during the transition. It laid out a clear strategy to attack and undermine the National Voter Registration Act. That's where this commission is going, and that is an attack on our democracy itself. The 1993 National Voter Registration Act, which, by the way, was passed on a bipartisan basis, has been one of the most important pieces of federal legislation that protects our voting rights, specifically as it pertains to facilitating people who are eligible registering to vote. This commission is working to the contrary. They're clearly working to make it harder for eligible Americans to register and to vote. And it's not just Secretary Kobach. Look at some of the other appointees of this commission. Ken Blackwell, J. Christian Adams, Hans Van Spakovsky, These gentlemen it's been clearly documented, have spent decades working to roll back the clock on voting rights. They're going backwards on voter registration, backwards on the Voting Rights Act itself. You know, when the commission, even before meeting, by the way, first sent out the letter to states requesting an unprecedented amount of personal information on every voter in America. The letter was signed by Secretary Kobach, not the Vice President. It was a dangerous request, an invasion of privacy for every voter in America. California was one of the first, but thankfully we were not by far the only state to push back and say no. Since then, you've seen Republican and Democratic secretaries alike push back on this dangerous request for sensitive voter data on all Americans. And just yesterday, in court papers, the commission has admitted, what do they intend to do with the data that they can collect? They want to store it on White House computers, have White House personnel have direct access to this data. That's unacceptable, and it's dangerous. It violates privacy, it violates voting rights, and it goes contrary to every cybersecurity recommendation any expert would give you. I know California has spoken. Californians have spoken. We do not want our sensitive personal information in the hands of Trump and anybody whose purpose is to dismantle voting rights in America. And I, as Secretary of State, on behalf of many, many of my colleagues, will not allow it. Indeed, tens of thousands of Americans have already submitted their thoughts and comments to the commission that's being convened today. They did it electronically because that was the only invitation to submit thoughts and comments. Tens of thousands of Americans have sent their opinions to the commission, and they too are saying no, hands off of our personal information. And whether it's intentional or unintentional, it's clear to me that Trump and the Republican Congress are looking in the wrong direction. So if they were genuine about strengthening the integrity of our elections, we have the blueprint for what they should be working on. Number one, don't investigate the American people. Investigate Russia. The intelligence community is unanimous and clear in their findings that Russians interfered with the 2016 election. And every day that goes by, that the president and his administration continues to deny it, is one day less that we have to prepare for the 2018 elections and to maximize the security and integrity of elections going forward. Number two, as has been stated, let's fund new systems in the United States of America. The last time the federal government was a true partner in funding, upgrading, and adding secure systems to our elections was in 2002, when the Help America Vote Act was passed, also on a bipartisan basis. Number three, don't eliminate, fund the EAC, the Elections Assistance Commission, the very body we look to that sets the security standards for voting systems in the country, the very body we look to aggregate data of what's working, what's not working in elections administration to make it better for voters and more secure. The Republican Congress is seeking to eliminate it when we need them now more than ever. And four, restore the Voting Rights Act, because these blatant attacks on our voting rights have come in the last several years since the Supreme Court's decision on Shelby v. Holder. This decision, gutting Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, the preclearance requirement, has opened the floodgates to the voter suppression laws that are running rampant state by state, and we now see as the single agenda for this fraud commission, and we will not stand for it. It's now my honor to introduce a friend and a colleague from the state of Texas, Representative Joaquin Castro.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you to Jason Kander and Terry Sewell for chairing this commission, this DNC commission. Thank you to Alex and everybody who has been part of this effort to speak up against the Trump Commission that undoubtedly will strip away the rights of so many American voters throughout the country. Voting should not be an obstacle course. The problem that we have in the United States of America is not that too many people vote too often. It's that not enough people vote in each of our elections. And I say that coming from the state of Texas, which has among the worst records, if not the worst record, in trying to do everything that it can because of its leaders, Greg Abbott and other Republican state leaders, trying to do everything that it can to suppress the vote. Repeatedly, federal court after federal court has found that the state government has violated the rights of so many Texans, including African American and Hispanic Texans. And so when we think about voter ID, which this Kobach or Trump Commission is likely to promote, what we're talking about is really a political point shaving process. They realize that 95% of people may have the approved ID necessary to go vote. But how many elections can you win in that 3 or 5% difference? And to speak very specifically to that, the other day I came across a study of Harris County. Harris County is the largest county in Texas. Several million people in Harris County. And in the 2016 election, after it was over, Harris County voters were surveyed, and 1 in 7 Harris County voters who didn't vote said that a big reason they didn't vote was because they didn't have the state-approved ID. In other words, the voter ID laws are having that pernicious effect that was not coincidental, but intended. That is the political point shaving that is intended. And if we allow this Trump Commission to be successful, then it won't be Texas and several other states that will have this problem. This will be a problem for all Americans throughout the country. And what's the result in the great state of Texas? Texas consistently ranks in the bottom 3, sometimes last, in voter participation, election after election. So many people are disenfranchised. So many people have decided or been kept from going to vote. I think it's also important to realize that there are other measures that they're likely to take on this Trump Commission to disenfranchise voters. Let me give you one example from 2011, I believe, in Texas, that didn't get as much attention as voter ID, but I think is just as pernicious in our efforts to get people out to vote. So what the Texas legislature did back then was, it used to be that if you were going in to register people to vote in Texas, you only had to be deputized to register people you could be deputized across the state. In other words, you just needed to get deputized in one place in Texas. They changed the law so that if you want to register voters, you had to get registered in each of the 254 counties. In other words, you had to get registered for every county that you were going to go try to register voters in. So for Harris County, if you were deputized in Harris County, you could only register voters in Harris County. You couldn't go to a neighboring county and do the same thing. So we also have to be watchful and mindful of these other behind-the-scenes smaller efforts that also represent obstacle after obstacle. When you combine something like voter ID with gerrymandering, you can see the incredible negative effect that it has on our participatory democracy. I've said before, and I'll speak for myself, that politicians should no longer be drawing their own political districts. We have to get to a point like California where you have a nonpartisan or bipartisan commission that's drawing our political districts across the country. Then Americans, I believe, will feel that the process is fairer and feel more invested in that political process. We should be moving to a place of automatic voter registration. Why is it that we still have a system where it's 2 steps in order to be able to vote? I hope one day that we can get to a place of online voting. But as Terry and I know well from our work on the Intelligence Committee, the first thing we have to do is secure our voting systems. I have been shocked, as many Americans have been, by something the Trump administration has not lifted a finger to do a thing about, which is the fact that there is no law on the books right now that requires those who run our election systems, whether it's counties or states, to do a single thing to guard our voting systems. There is no basic minimum requirement for cybersecurity protection of our voting systems that exists in the United States. And that is a tragedy, and that's the real danger to our democracy. And so thank everybody for their effort. We're going to be watching what this Trump Commission does. I know the American people will also be watching. And again, we need to do everything possible to make sure more people vote, not to make it harder for Americans to vote.
With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions that y'all have.
David Smith of The Guardian. Do you feel there's a concerted effort to target African American voters in particular, given the majority of them tend to vote Democratic?
Yes. Anybody else?
Yes.
Good.
I think it's no coincidence that that the target has been in vulnerable communities.
Come on in here.
I think it's no coincidence that the target has been in vulnerable communities of color, brown and black communities all across this nation. But we can't underestimate the fact that the disabled and our senior citizens and our young folks are also disadvantaged as well. And I think that if you take nothing away from this press conference, I hope that you take away the fact that we as elected officials should be about making it easier for people to vote, not making it harder. And the fact that the Trump administration would put this sham of a commission forward when there are legitimate election integrity issues that they could be taking up instead of asking for personal identifiable information, it is a travesty. And I think that the American people deserve better. And that's what we hope to work on. Obviously, it's a lot of targeting. I think that one North Carolina's court, appellate court, said it's with precision, surgical precision, that they were that these voter ID laws were crafted in order to, with surgical precision, target African American communities. But it's communities of color all across this country, but as well as our disabled. My father. He was disabled, and while he was highly motivated to go vote because I was on the ballot, and the state of Alabama had introduced a new photo ID law right after the Shelby decision that no longer let him go vote with his validly issued federal ID called a Social Security card. Let me repeat that, a validly issued federal ID called a Social Security card. Instead, the state of Alabama now requires a special voter card. And the fact that it took our family a couple of hours to get my dad ready, dressed to go to the county courthouse, and that county courthouse happened to be grandfathered into the American Disabilities Act, so it didn't have to have a ramp. Okay, I'm a member of Congress, so they quickly got several guards to come and help my dad in his wheelchair up the steps, only to find out that the voting registration office, which is on the second floor, the one elevator in this small county courthouse was out of order. By the time they got someone to fix it, because they were highly motivated to help my dad get to vote, get to his photo ID, you know, the person was out to lunch. How many Americans, it's not about how many, you know, counting how many marbles are in a jar anymore. But these are modern day barriers that are just as pernicious, that are just as dangerous, that stop people, average Americans, from exercising their right to vote. And so I think that this commission will, you know, we will be watching, but America should be watching as well. And there's lots that we can be doing to make sure that we protect election integrity. But this sham of a commission is not one of them.
Others? No?
Can I try one more?
Sure.
The president made that claim, I think, on Twitter months ago that millions of people voted illegally. I know you reject that. Do you have a rough estimate of what the true figure is? Are we talking tens or hundreds or thousands?
Well, you can look at Kansas. I mean, the person who's essentially leading this commission, not this one, but the other commission, is Secretary of State Kobach from Kansas, who spent just tons of dollars, Kansas taxpayer dollars, to try and prove the idea that there was all sorts of illegal voting going on. I think they ended up in 1.7 million ballots. I think they found 9 cases, and it wasn't even necessarily what the president was describing. Look, this is a lie. I mean, he's the president, and we're Americans, so we would really prefer to be polite. Right? Not just us, but I mean, as a country, that's our reaction. When the president tells the biggest lie that a president has ever told, our natural inclination, good-hearted inclination, is to try and give that all the benefit of the doubt we possibly can. But there's nothing you can use, no word you can use to describe this other than it is a lie.
It's a lie. And as a Secretary of State, having convened recently with Republican and Democratic colleagues from across the country, you know, here's the president's lies in context. First, there's no truth to the massive voter fraud he claims, the millions of illegal votes. Not a shred of evidence. But what he does when he repeats these allegations, when he repeats these accusations, he calls into question the professionalism and the integrity, not just of every Secretary of State or Chief Elections Officer in the country, but the county elections directors across the land, both Republican and Democrat, and the countless volunteers who give of their time to serve the nation as poll workers. To suggest that there's massive voter fraud is to impugn the integrity of so many people who work so hard for the right to vote, to defend the right to vote, and for those who facilitate Americans exercising the right to vote. And what does the president do? He ignores what the Russians did in 2016 and chooses to investigate Americans? That's wrong, and that's undemocratic and un-American.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, man. You too. Well done. Yeah, good job. Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Oh, yeah. All right.
Power red.
And then powder red in the middle. We're going to take a group picture real quick.